Hi again everyone. We are looking at something today that a lot of people ask me about, a lot of people have a little bit of nervousness about, and that's working with jersey, how you prepare your pattern, cut out your pattern pieces, and how you get your sewing machine nicely set up. So this tutorial is all about the preparation you can do to make sure your jersey project turns out perfectly. So the first thing to do is have a little look at our pattern. Now I've got mine stored in rolls here. I've printed out the PDF. I've put them together using the numbers and letters along the top and down the side to make sure I have all the pieces in the right place. I tend to sellotape mine together as opposed to gluing. I just tend to find that they stay together a little longer, and I store them rolled up like this with a little paper clip at one end and the other. They tend to store a lot better if you roll them than they do if you fold them, if they're all stuck together as a PDF. We want to have our patterns rolled out on the table in front of us, and we're going to trace off the size of pattern that we want to use. Now I'm going to make for my eldest, so I'm going to use the size 3 pattern that runs from ages 9 to 12, but children are very ambiguous in the sizes they fall under, and if you want to measure up your pattern pieces just against the measurements that are in the instructions before you decide on your size, it is best to do that. So always best to check the measurements before you go ahead and cut. I am going to trace my pattern off. You can just cut out the size you want, but then of course you'll be printing the pattern again when you want to make another size. So I'm just going to use some dot and cross paper to trace out my pattern, going around all the lines that I need. Dot and cross paper, you can buy it on a roll like this, or you can buy it by the metre. And you can get that sent through the post at the moment as well, from your local haberdashery shops, or you can just use something as simple as brown paper or wrapping paper. As long as it's big enough to fit your pattern pieces on, it doesn't have to be anything fancy at all. Once my patterns are traced, I'm going to pop them away safely again, and we'll have a little look at the fabrics we've got. So I have gone for some lovely tractor fabric and a contrast of blue. Now I bought 2 meters of the tractor fabric because I'm making the top and the bottoms of the pyjamas, and I bought 1/2 meter of contrast fabric. Now this contrast fabric has a really good 4-way stretch, so that just simply means the sleeves that I'm going to do in the contrast fabric, I can put it either way on the grain of the fabric and it will work absolutely fine. If your contrast fabric also has a direction the same as your main fabric, then you may just need to buy a little bit more to make sure you can get the lengths of the sleeves in place on the fabric. What you want to do is decide in advance which pieces are going to come from your contrast fabric and which pieces are going to come from your main fabric. Now for mine, I'm going to do the main body of the pyjamas, the pyjama legs and the waistband and the cuffs for the arms in my tractor fabric. My contrast fabric is going to be used for the sleeves, the neckband and for the cuffs of the pyjama legs. So those are the decisions I've made in advance, and then I'll just put the right pattern pieces with the right bit of fabric so I keep a track of that while I'm cutting out. I'm going to go for the tractor fabric first. The easiest thing to do when laying out your fabric is to have all the jersey on the table. You don't want too much hanging off the edges, otherwise you may get your pattern pieces slightly distorted just because the weight of the fabric pulls it down on one side or the other. When I'm working with jersey, because it is such a wide width, I don't tend to immediately use that fold that you normally get down the centre as the centre fold for the pieces. I'll bring enough across from one side so it's folded, I'll cut a pattern piece and then I'll fold it further over to get the next ones. So here I'm going to get the two body pieces, body front and body back, before folding it over once more to get the cuffs and fitting in the waistband. What I'll then do is I'll move down the fabric to get my two legs for the leggings of the pyjamas. So you're always thinking just how much you need for that individual piece and folding it so you're making the very most out of the fabric. For the contrast fabric, I'm going to fold over enough for one sleeve along the length of the fabric, because remember I said it's got 4-way stretch, and I'm going to get the most out of the fabric because I just bought 1/2 metre by laying the sleeve the other way round. Because I can, because there's no pattern direction. I'm going to fold it over enough to get one sleeve. Then I'm going to move the pattern piece and get the other sleeve. And then I'm going to fit in the cuff and the neckband into the small spaces in between where those arms have been cut. So again, I'm trying to make the very most out of the fabric that I possibly can. So work through slowly, pinning on each pattern piece as you go, and then cut all the way around them so you have your pieces ready to move on to setting up your machine to make your pyjamas. Okay, so you've cut out all the pattern pieces ready for your jersey project. You've got everything ready apart from your sewing machine. Now, there are loads of different types of jersey, so it's really important each time you cut out a project to run some samples through your machine before you start sewing on the real thing. The important thing is to get the right kind of stitch for the jersey you have and to know what looks right and what doesn't quite look right. Now, some machines have jersey and stretch stitches. By all means try these, but they don't suit every jersey, and I quite often find that I am setting up my machine slightly differently rather than just automatically using the jersey settings. So for the jersey project we are looking at today, I've got some offcuts of the fabric I'm going to be using. This is a long thin strip. It's running up and down the grain of the fabric. I've folded it over, so there's 2 layers of fabric, and I'm going to sew a nice straight line into the fabric as if I'm joining a seam. Now, the setting I'm going to start with on the machine is a zigzag stitch, and it's going to be a width of 1.5 and a length of 1.5. So that's really my starting point with all jersey, and sometimes that works absolutely fine, and sometimes it needs a little bit of adjustment so that it can lay nice and flat, and I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. So I've got 1.5 and 1.5 zigzag stitch for running through this little jersey sample. I'm going to pop it underneath the machine. I'm going to make sure it's got plenty of fabric underneath at the start of the sewing, so the presser foot is clearly on the fabric. You're not starting at the very edge, otherwise it probably won't move forward, it'll just chew the edge. So you want to have plenty of fabric under there to make sure the feed dogs underneath can move the fabric forward. And then I'm just going to sew a line and see how that looks. That's sitting pretty quite nice and flat already. So 1.5 and 1.5, as I said earlier, that's my normal starting point for when I'm testing jersey samples, and for this particular fabric, it looks absolutely fine. Now, things to look for when you're doing your samples are the fabric pulling out and bumping, almost lettucing like a wave. That simply means that your stitch is too short for the jersey, and you should lengthen the stitch ever so slightly. So maybe go up by degrees through to maybe a maximum length of about two and a bit, to make sure that your fabric is laying nice and flat. If your fabric looks like it's gathering together, then you could probably use a slightly shorter stitch. If your stitch is too long, when you pull your seam apart on the jersey, looking at the right side, you will see the stitches very clearly, whereas when you use a smaller stitch, you really won't see them quite as much. So it's better to use the smallest stitch you can that keeps the fabric nice and flat. So we've sorted out what we want to do with our seams, and now we need to have a look at hems. On this project, the pyjama top has a hem that runs round at the waistline. So what I'm going to do is show you how to do a triple stitched hem with the triple stitch on the machine. What you want to start by doing is fold up your hem and give it a press into place, ready for sewing, and press that all the way round. You sew the whole thing as a continuous circle. Once it's all nicely pressed, you can pop some pins in just to hold it in place while you're working with it, but do take those out before your needle reaches them. And we're going to be sewing from the right side of the fabric. So once it's all pressed, turn it over so the right side is going to be facing up towards you. And you can feel with your fingers where the edge of the jersey reaches to, so where you've got 2 layers of fabric and where you've just got 1. What you want to do is using the triple stitch, and that's the stitch on the machine that shows 3 little stitches going one way and then 3 little stitches going the opposite way. So it's going to jump 3 times as it works backwards and forwards. It's a large zigzag that has 3 little stitches to each zig and each zag. Line up where you can feel the edge of your fabric underneath, so where it turns from 1 layer to 2, you want to run your zigzag stitches so they just reach the edge of that layer of fabric underneath, so just as it turns from 1 layer to 2 layers. And you're going to pop that underneath the machine and stitch all the way round. Now the length settings and the width settings, they can be played with just a little bit. The length of the stitch is normally set automatically to just a 1, so it's quite a short stitch, but remember it's going to go 3 stitches for every movement back and forward, so it needs to be quite short. The width of the stitch you can play with. Mine's set right up on a 5, so it'll be quite a wide zigzag, but it depends on what you're working on. If you want a more petite version, you can bring that width of the stitch down, but I wouldn't bring it much under a 3, otherwise your stitches really will be a bit too compressed. So the standard settings for this triple stitch are a length of 1 and a width of 5, and that's what I'm going to use for the hem on these pyjamas today. Again, I'm running a sample, so I'm not doing this for the first time on the real thing. I'm putting a sample, an offcut of fabric through the machine so that I've got a mock version of what I'm going to be working on, and I can see exactly how those stitches are going to sit. Just like with the seams, if you start to see gathers, then you can get away with a slightly shorter stitch, which should smooth out the fabric. If you start to see it lettucing, if it gathers into bumps, then you want to use a slightly longer stitch. So you can go up ever so slightly to make sure that those bumps relax out and you haven't got the fabric almost being stretched by the stitches. Once you have your sample sorted, remember to write down exactly the settings that you've used for the seams and for the hem, just in case you need to look back at them later on, or in fact you've got a similar weight jersey. You can actually write on the samples the settings you used and keep those in your sewing box for next time. I really hope this video has helped with some of those fears about your initial pinning, cutting and setting up for sewing with jersey. Like I said at the beginning, I get asked about it an awful lot, so I thought this video would be really helpful for those of you venturing into using jersey for those first few times. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.